where Job has a whole series of dialogues where God actually starts listing in what ways he's wondrous. But what Job is constantly doing is saying how he's heard the call, he lives by the call, and he will not be deflected by the call, no matter what happens, even if it's from God himself. And so, whereas the wondering is an exploratory, almost innocence-driven mode of engaging the world, the wondrous is more like the world calling back to us to react to something that is momentous, may mark us for life if we take up the call. So in Anderson's thinking, he calls that, in a much more muted way, a productive ethos, which is that you get on and take risks and move forward, typically in a group or a movement. And in my case, it also relates to the idea that you see things that happen, and sometimes you see a moment of excellence. You think, I could do that, or we could do that, or wow, imagine even trying to do that. So the wondrous is more like a call, and the wondering is more like a discovery process. The wonderment is more like an openness state, like feeling the world is there and it's not curious, but it's open to you to engage it. And the thing that's interesting to me here is a Roman interpretation of this, which is, in terms of ancient Rome and its legacy, we tend to think of Rome cultural legacy in terms of, practicality, empire building, management of armies, the high politics of senatorial intrigues, and so on. But one of the odd things about Roman culture is that, for all its grandeur and all those things, it had a fundamental, almost inferiority complex with regard to culture. So it was almost required to have Greek tutors to refine the young of Roman society into the more subtle notions of philosophy and ways of living consistent with much more Greek or Hellenic sensibilities. So it also means then that one of the ways I think about this is Roman Empire is sort of like an expansive, moving forward sort of spreading operation. And a good contrast here is to think, when Romans came across a point where there could be an intersection, they call that a three-way, trevia, meaning you're on the one path already going. You're not going to be going back. You're going forward. The only question is, do you go left or right? And they would, in fact, build cities by creating what Greeks would think of as an intersection, or we call this intersection, but they call it a three-way. And the interesting thing there is that that process almost then drew behind the legions, and later this flow of culture coming down to the tutorials, to the schools, and so on. And on top of that, the same logic applies to gradients, not just of culture, but also the aqueduct is a really good metaphor for a Roman imperial presence, is that it draws fresh water from high hills and delivers it to the rest of the people. And similarly, it would expand, and where it hit mountains, often go dig down and dig up silver and salt and so on. So the whole empire's got this gradient quality to it of, it's not enough where it is as it stands. And I think the European legacy still has that, in the sense of being curious that some things that really matter to us are outside of our own founding mythologies and stories. The Jews did, well, not so much the Jews, the Christians copied that when they had the New Testament. So they did the same, thinking you can't throw away the Old Testament because there's stuff there we can still dig out. So wonderment has this notion that there's a lack that you're wanting to fill, and the world is there ready to fill the lack. And that structure has much more to do with love, which I'll get to in a minute, because social innovation is powered by a certain way of deploying love. Okay, so let's look at next one here. If you treat those three elements, wondrous, wondering, and wonderment, and think of those three together as animating what you do, which is you're realistic in your engagement with the world, as opposed to, you'll see on the diagram there, as opposed to being relativistic, And if you've got a productive ethos as opposed to a consumption-oriented or comfort-seeking ethos, and if you're searching for suffrage, and this one's a bit complicated, suffrage rather than sovereignty, then you're doing social renovation. The opposites, where you have sovereignty, relativism, and consumption, you have the modern social reformist liberal democracy mode, where there's a basis of authority in the form of a sovereign or a sovereign power, authority. You have the notion that there are different points of view which need to be tolerated and maybe even encouraged. And there's the notion that the arrangement of this form of living can deliver goods and services and protection to the people under that sovereign rule. And for a variety of reasons, John Anderson spent a fair bit of time writing about this, which he thought of that as becoming potentially a servile state, where the sovereign, rather than just defending boundaries, starts to provide all sorts of other things. In the end, lots of goodies, eventually even licensing recognitions that, you have the right to have a definition that you think others should respect, etc. So that's a depiction. But what's interesting here is I think we're on a tipping point where that structure, this inner triangle, is running into a difficulty. So if you take social reformism alone just now and see it as a triangle like that, I think there's now signs that sovereignty, either internally or between sovereign powers, is more inclined to produce violence. The consumption in all sorts of ways, whether it's industrial consumption, personal consumptions, the ratio of waste, the ratio of how long stuff's used as a consumption good before it's thrown away is going up. And the relativism is becoming, in a sense, highly assertive. So it's expressed as umbrage. So if we have a vicious circle here of umbrage, violence, and waste, it becomes increasingly difficult even to participate in the old-fashioned way of social reformist etiquette and politics, which is then leading to the problem of people then maybe looking for other ways of coping, which is where you get the other social change strategies. So in the middle there, you see they've got social reformism, which I'm calling social democracy, which is made up of relativism, sovereignty, and comfort. And on the outer extreme, you've got social renovation, which you've yet to fully elaborate, but it involves productive ethos, realism, and suffrage. And then you've got these permutations. So where you have a situation where you have realism, sovereignty, and comfort, that I'm calling social revolution, because communism, in theory, it might have other ways, but the way it ends up involving itself is this, assuming the proletariat can be the master sovereign power, and that can guarantee, because of the productive nature of technology, comfort and leisure for all. We know there's all sorts of issues that go right and wrong with that. I don't want to get into those, but just that's the way I see it fitting into this option. And there are people even now, because of this waste, umbrage, and violence, even reinventing, maybe there's a way to think about that with other kinds of universal classes instead of the proletariat. At the other extreme, where you have productive ethos but relativism and sovereignty, is what I call social restoration or imperialism, where you allow for relativism because you've got different crafts, cultures, ethnicities, but you have a strong sovereign power. British Empire would be this, but that's powered by a view of productive ethos. It can get out there, socialize the natives, house the different needs, and provide free trade inside that imperial structure. Where you have realism and productive ethos, then I'm calling that social regimentation. Two examples of which would be like the missions in South America during the Catholic missionaries. Fascism is another form of the same thing, because they've got a view of what's real and how that has to be, you can't deny it. And if we do that, we have a productive ethos that can be unleashed if we get rid of these distractions that otherwise get in its way. Productive ethos and suffrage, but with relativism, gives us globalism, where I'll get to suffrage in a minute, because that's a bit of a slippery term, but the notion here is interests anyway will come to the surface if you have markets that respond to needs. So globalist thinking says, let's restructure so people can have a go with their productive ethos, exploit their comparative advantage, go to market, and what is their produce becomes someone else's delight, and we can get global trade and so on. And that has been an ethos that's probably been functioning for a while, but is coming adrift, partly because the relativism is actually being replaced by umbrage, and partly because the suffrage that was promised isn't working either. But anyway, and then the last one there is, sorry, on the other extreme is the opposite, which is localism, where you have realism about the locality, expressions of common interest because it's a local group, and they find comfort in the equilibrium they have within their village, their setting, their commune, or whatever it is. And finally, you have where suffrage comes to the surface all by itself in seek of comfort and from all sorts of relative positions, which you get social resistance and social movements. And that's where you get these strange alliances where, for example, with climate change demonstrations, there you get all kinds of different people common in their belief that there's something clearly wrong without necessarily having a view of what is going to come, unless they flip over towards sovereignty, in which case they go into the political arena and they're back into being a political force inside social reformism. So I'm not going to deal with all the 6 in there, but I just wanted to give a context of how one might situate these different social change strategies. Now, just a minute. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is where it gets considerably more complicated, is the productive ethos, and this happens in a number of different contexts, but John Anderson does it. Jean-Luc Nancy, French philosopher, does the same thing, which is that what is it that makes things productive here? So at one level, in the bottom you see this table, you can think of a foundation of habits, good habits. And that's a common thing, and a good example. A lot of English social thought had the idea of, if you instill good habits, we're going to have good order. So, and the habits can be across structuring the otherwise rampant feelings we might have or passions that we might have. It might involve how we structure what we believe, and it involves also how we structure how we strive. And we do that today. We go to, classes to improve our walking or muscularity and so on. We might go to etiquette school as an overlay on top of what otherwise might have been better habits. And we seek therapy in terms of personalities to be out of the grip of certain trauma and so on. But there's another level above that, which is a sort of interactional level, and often corporate, which I call social habitations, which is the question of how we dwell in the world and how we have a canopy of opinions that make us understand the world, and how we have mechanisms to control sections inside that world. And they are common corporate disciplines too, of design, information, and management. Now, the problem has been, because these have not been done in a social innovative way, design, information, and management inside corporate context almost become parodies of that. So design becomes a tyranny of gadgetry, information becomes a plethora of gloss, and management becomes a sort of intricacies of games. So gadgets, gloss, and games end up running corporate life way off beam to the original mandate or mission that might have made them an interesting thing to be pursuing. And not just commercial corporate life, but also government, not-for-profit, and so on. And then on top of that, again, at a societal level, you have what you might think of as habitats, which are much more world-enclosing entities, and there may be a plurality of them. So there are a plurality of worlds. There's lots of different formalized discourses, and there's a series of common understandings about how whole masses of people might interact. We tend to think, and rightly so at one level, that the thing that makes world meaningful is religion, and what makes discourses productive rather than chatter is the rigor of science. And in terms of negotiated understandings, we start to institutionalize things. So getting on a tram doesn't become a negotiation. You know what you're supposed to do in your role as a commuter, and others know what they're supposed to do in offering up seats and so on. Now, the issue here is each one of those is where suffrage can happen. So to give a simple example, take personality. At the moment now, there's a plethora of personality therapy upgrade interventions that try to work out how you can release yourself from the grip of trauma, marginalization, disability, and so on. And it also propagates as a discourse at another level of allowing people to be doing this. Now, in the social renovation ventures I've been doing over about 20 years, I'm only just now bringing it all out as all the different levels I'm dealing with. You find this really common in learning settings. So, for example, in the uni system I was in, a lot of times, and this was in Tasmania, so it was a little place, and the university is a small place. So the idea was people come and learn, but because they were being taught embryonic forms of some things I'm talking about now, the students actually found themselves getting quite excited about things they could actually do. But quite a few of them would hesitate, feel doubt, backtrack, find a reason why they can't do it. And the tendency was in the culture there, and it's got a lot worse now, was to sort of find an exoneration, is to sort of go to counselling and get a letter and have a delay. And I'd be saying, well, yeah, that's fine, but this can't go on forever. You're going out into the world. And what I found by carefully listening to what they were talking about, I found that I could keep eliciting aspects of character. Now, a way to think about this is that personality, to give you a simple example, you have sort of a personality, and there's lots of theories of personality, but let's just take one which assumes that you've got an ability to imagine your state, a way to articulate your state, a way to sort of calm down and talk about the state, and the felt sense you have of the state you're in. Now, therapists will work on that, but what was interesting, and Jung did a really interesting thing here, but then he mucked it up at one point, which is if you think of these four components, they can all interchange in various ways. And he, I think, cleverly marked out that you can have feeling, thinking, judgment, perception, intuitive, and sensate modes of engagement. He then added introversion and extroversion, but actually in this system, introversion, extroversion run inside these things. So, for example, if you're dealing with thinking, and you think of that as what makes you available to people as a thinker, is one is you can communicate what's going on, and at the other extreme, you can be competent. So extroverted-oriented form of thinking becomes communicative. An introverted form of thinking can become enclosed in the competence that it's really good at. We call them boffins, say. And ditto with all the other things. So that intuition, you can have curiosity and courage. And you can go for, in regard to being perceptive, operating in a charming mode or a coherent mode. Now, I won't list them all here because but there's 12 aspects of character here. So instead of thinking of the blob of personality with its dynamics and its wobbly forms and its stress points, you try to find the points of accomplishment where you quickly narrate, there's an example of courage. Here's an example of that was a charming thing. Here's a place where you stayed consistent, and so on. And with a bit of narration and concretizing it with things that are done, it's interesting to watch a shift away from the need to narrate the difficulty to a quiet interest, and particularly if you start setting up encounters at the next level where you can go do something with it. It's disarming of disability and trauma. And in some cases, I'll give you a really strident one. I had one case of a student that had all sorts of trauma. And she was a mature age and just clearly, we might say, informally damaged, but had gone through a lot. Anyway, at a certain point where she was doing this thesis, and she'd done quite well at constructing it, she was having to write it up, but of course, crises came and she couldn't write. So I said, what's wrong here? And she wouldn't say. I said, look, there's a deal here. I've just spent all this time. You tell me what's wrong, and I can then judge which way to fit it. And she described a reasonably horrific event. And my reaction was to say, in the description you just gave, where were you looking from? Are you looking out from your eyes at the receiving end? Are you looking at it from the outside? Where are you looking at it from? And she said, from above. And so I jumped in at that point and said, look, it might be a really scarring wound for you, but for others, they will pay serious money if you can do that in a professional context. So let's work on that. And so she did. And she ended up solving some serious problems because she could melt into really fraught environments and just charm people, get on board, and then pinpoint where something was going wrong. And one of them was a smelter where the metallurgists and the workers didn't always communicate. Metallurgists changed operations and the workers didn't know, and then the whole stack then gets clagged up and they have to strip it bare, and like millions of dollars to get it all fixed up and rerunning and recommissioned. And it turned out she spotted 2 or 3 interactions and individuals that were causing thing, and then the company realized that they should have a worker being the coordinator of the smelter and not let the metallurgists just walk in and out as if they're the head chef. And by doing that shift, they thwarted that particular buried interaction that no one had seen before, and she got it. And so now she's now even published books. But the point is, and there's taught 2,500 of these people. So I'm not speaking of just one case here, but there's a general tendency, if you take the risk to just look for what go out, the pedagogy can lift the personality out of the dynamics of personality and into the crystalline structure of character. So that's an example where the renovation runs with regard to people in a pedagogy setting. But if you go up one level in the realm of feelings again and look at dwelling, in modern times, we get all sorts of mod cons and gadgets and comforts and sofas and blah to just chill out, to lean on stuff and sit there while stuff's piped to us. Now, that's often design. You have, grand designs, you can see stuff like that. Now, in the context of Sydney and here, I've actually renovated 2, well, not so much here yet, I'm doing it now, but in Sydney, a large building. Again, not from an architectural point of view, but from the sociological, social interactive point of view. So, for example, the design of kitchens, the one here we've just finished, is optimized around maximizing face-to-face encounter. If you look at most kitchens, you're actually facing a wall or a window with a sink in front of you, or a fridge or a stove or a workbench. And so people, marital partners have to turn their head to look at each other. And if you're pissed off, you don't turn your head so people can see you're pissed off and you're not turning your head. But there's no communication, so there's no responsibility to sort of get to the bottom of it. You can actually just sulk and keep going through the kitchen because it's designed for through-way food deliveries, freezer, fridge, bench, grab it. And when you study it more carefully, you can actually have families which literally will walk past the mother in the kitchen, barely grunting hello, open the fridge, grab stuff, go around into the sofa, put it in front of the TV and start munching. Now, design can do a lot better than that. And there are 2 really good designers in this regard. Christopher Alexander, English guy, architect, wrote a book called A Pattern Language. He also wrote a little article, if you want to look up on the internet, Cities Are Not Trees. So he does it at the level of a whole city design. And he plays on the fact that design involves the issue of intersecting functions. So the discipline there is, if you think of what's the function of the design, what's the face of the design, how does it appear, what's the form of the design, and what forces it has to endure, you end up with 6 interchanges, just like I showed with personality. And they are 6 design competencies. And the guy that wrote Design for the Real World, whose name escapes me right now, and he's in here somewhere, Papanak, that's right, Papanak, Design for a Real World, deals with these exact 6 functions. He's the only one I've found that catches them. And you can train people to actually do this. And there's a form of design then that becomes very convivial and interaction and encouraging, rather than this thing of people, as it were, escaping into their house or unit, then escaping from the kitchen into their bedrooms and atomizing. And of course, then the social media networks can feed distractions and aggro or whatever it is. And that's, people sell houses that are actually designed to maximize that. And at the top level, you've got religion, which because we're sitting in the legacy of medieval religion hegemony, we're kind of down on religion for a variety of historical reasons. But the interesting thing is, they are the symbolic systems that can capture the totality of the world, particularly with regard to its fate or destiny. And one interesting one I've done, and I'm a sort of crypto-Catholic in that I get intrigued with what Catholics do, partly because my grandfather was a rebel priest in Mussolini's time and came to a difficult end for being so outspoken. And conversely, also in my teenage years, I was in Rome and actually living opposite the hotel or the monastery where the Vatican II bishops were all hanging out. So, and being an altar boy there, I came across an internationally spread variety of people that were just, at that age, I thought, an amazing collage of very bright, interesting people. Anyway, I mean, there's a lot of things that go right and wrong, etc., and even more so today. But the interesting thing is, in looking at life stages, if you take a good example, Heidegger's Fourfold, where he talks about how we are thrown in a world where there's, he describes it as sky, gods, earth, and mortals, but he basically means that from the perspective of the gods, there are potential for narrative and meaning that comes from spirits or whatever we want to do. It doesn't have to be a Christian God. The sky is the world of representational manifestation of what we can name and call, and mortals are humans that travel in that world aware of immortality, and earth is the beingness of all that world surging forth from nature and so on. Now, as it turns out, if you run those as 6 different interchanges, mortals to gods gives you confirmation, earth to gods gives you last rites, gods to the sky give you marriage, sky to earth gives you baptism, and then confession gives you sky to mortals, and communion gives you mortals to earth, and mortals to gods gives you confirmation. Now, it doesn't matter the detail of that. The important thing is taking these life course markers and reinventing them so that they function in a different way. So, for example, in one case I did with my father when I went to Italy and he was dying, and he was in a mess of things, and it was, a sick person, but he was going to fight it off. But anyway, it's hopeless. So I said, no, you're going to die in 40 days. So let's do something interesting. So we went around, dressed him up, shaved him. And in Italy, you do not go out into a cafe with all sorts of qualms about your health. You've got to hide it. So dressed him up, went around. And of course, he started to remember places he'd seen in Vicenza. So we did a round trip, and lo and behold, he went back in time and normal things, which was good. At the end, I thought, he's getting quite weak now. So took him to the parish priest, because he's Catholic. And this was a lovely example of renovation and tradition. Knock at the door, priest says, well, yeah, hi, my father's dying. And he seems all right, he's in a wheelchair. Because they're thinking, call us at the last minute when there's someone splattering and gasping and so on. They do grand gestures and people feel better because of the release of grief and so on. But I said, no, he's too old to sin anymore, but he's still awake enough to remember what his misadventures were. Whereupon the priest thought that was quite funny, and then thought, okay, come on in, have a coffee, and let's talk about it. My dad found it quite, because he's in a mode of recalling things, so he sort of found that quite a releasing process. Not in the sense that he then thought he's going to heaven or anything like that, just he found that releasing. He came back to the amazement of his wife, my mother, thinking, yeah, let's just take this on, and died about 3 days later. And there are similar, a good example with baptism now is because of inequality. I haven't done this yet, but I was intrigued with this process, is to find people, not just family extras, but find people that are prepared to be a godparent or godparents on a certain function, godparent for education, godparent for dealing with government, so you might have 2 or 3 or 4 pairs of godparents in a margin, because you're in a marginal setting, but they might be a link to something else if things happen. There's a famous sociological essay written by Volpato called The Strength of Weak Ties, where he found that communities that are marginal is the next one, but have contacts with people beyond the community, albeit weak, can mobilize those things in a moment of crisis and become more resilient. So there's an etiquette here of what people think as a matter of what today we might call virtue signaling, but it actually has a purpose, which is how many God kids do you have? I've got 6 pairs, six of them between us, only for a certain function. And so, for a good example here, which is coming through us, is the collapse or the decay of public education means there's a growing movement for homeschooling, which has all sorts of other problems. There are franchises, there's religious zealots, there's a whole set of different people with, as it were, separate agendas with regard to the actual precious challenge of instilling culture into another generation. But you could work a logic out, and there's a way of doing that in terms of software, to have a system where you've got a market for baptismal candidates amongst people that are prepared to be a weak link to an uncertain future. So they're just 3 examples going up on the level of feelings. So all of that. So initially, you've got feelings that can rip through personality, and they, as it were, crystallized in character. There are feelings that can wallow around in poor design places where it's designed to actually create good feelings. And you have destiny issues at both a biography and social level, where maybe religious practices can be redesigned or renovated to meet the modern settings that they now function in. A good example too is confirmations. Another good example, like the number of young men, women I come across who think that time is now to have a gap year, find myself, travel, meander, or get in with a contact, like what's his name's going to get me into real estate, so-and-so's going to get me to something else. There's no sense of calling. There's no sense of what are you going to risk ever. And that's a trait that's now being discovered by people on the outside of Australia who are exploiting it. Just think of this as a crazy statistic. We have probably pissed off easily 5,000 really, really smart Chinese students as overseas students here in Australia. Treated them badly, marginalised them, didn't really give them what they wanted. But they discovered that what happens here is it's who you know and hustling along. And they discover that from Beijing. They can ring someone here in real estate. Hey, could we do a deal on such and such? And then, yeah. Because there's money flowing down. And it's distressing to me in the sense of even though sovereignties are very loose and wobbly entity already, it's being eroded even further by these very subtle network effects that we're not even studying, let alone preventing. So that's the sort of reconstruction with regard to feelings. With regard to beliefs, and I'll do this a bit more quickly too, is at the level of a person, and this is interesting because we have this issue with beliefs now, like everyone knows about something, and then you have heated debates about stuff because they're not even debates, because we go back to Umbridge and relativism and so on. Is C.S. Peirce, Charles Peirce, wrote a lovely little article called The Fixation of Belief, where he argues about how do we fixate on beliefs that we will stand by. And he comes up with 4 of them. There's the issue of allowing yourself to be surprised. There's going with the fashion. There's the folkways that we've always had before. And there's the tenacity with which we uphold a principle. He left it at that, saying, oh, there's 4 ways. And he wanted to then say, well, actually, it's the surprise one that's the best way because that's what science does for us. But if you do it another way and think, how can they all communicate with each other? How do you go from fashion to folkways or tenacity to surprise? there's another 6 interchanges, each of which have opposite sides, and you end up with a series of communication etiquettes, which, if you train people to do it, generates what we would normally call civility. So it means things like understanding what's the source of the communication, what's the destination, what code's being used, what channel being used, what's the meaning of the message, what's the reference to it. These are all things that you can train people to get into, and not just train in the sense of in a classroom and through simulations, lots of different mechanisms, to have it so that instead of being ensconced in a hearsay bubble, you're actually exploiting or making a thing of being civil, not for the sense of being civil in politeness, but being keen to get the communication running as intensively as possible to get to the bottom of an issue. A bigger area that I've done a lot on this area, like many consultancies and things, with regard to the corporate setting of information, this is truly stunning now, because 20 years ago, data was just becoming more prominent and perverse, and you could, pervasive, and you could play with it a lot more. And I taught, again, thousands of students with that. But the interesting thing now with data silos and data systems, etc., people think of information like a sludge, like a fluid. Think of it, the best metaphor here is think of information as the same kind of word as explosion. Explosion is an event that destroys physical structure, better or worse by how well explosives have been located and timed to go off. Information is an event which explodes opinions that happen to be wrong if the informatives, which are transformations of data into some format that fits a setting, people go, oh, really? Why wasn't I told? A good example, there was a tourism agency of government in the 90s, Japan. And the Japanese wholesalers were inviting them over to stay there. And, it's great to have this sort of one-to-one relationship. Because the Japanese wanted, the wholesalers wanted all sorts of facilities to built for them. So, we'll even open up an office in Tokyo so we can liaise and, do the bus routes, etc., to satisfy the Japanese tourists who come on ships and stay for 3 or 4 days on average, or 5 days or whatever it was this morning. Meanwhile, at the same time, even more people coming from Europe, because by then, e.g., Tasmania was, green frontier, and Australia had all sorts of fascinations for Europeans, as it still does. So you got people from Denmark or whatever coming for 15 to 20 days, traveling from milk bar to place to backpacker, spending more money, longer period over more things. And there was no representation in Europe at all for this agency. And when they saw this statistic, they thought, well, I won't say what they said, but they were genuinely shocked. Now, that's an information event. They think, why aren't we facing Europe? Which they then did. And the Japanese market, by the way, then faded away as well. And there's a series of things inside information in terms of how you get the data, how you define its value relative to the concerns you've got, how you then measure the information load in the data in terms of syntactic information, how you then extract things into reports, how you visualize it, how you simulate the conclusions of the report through a simulation system, and then come back to the scenarios that originally motivated the ignorances that you had. So to concretize this for people, I had some, I used to say to, this is in Tassie, say, how much do you think it costs for a chocolate company like Cadbury's to launch another chocolate bar? Not any idea, really. I thought, well, I don't know, like how much? Well, you've got to think of the chemistry of it, the labeling, the taste. How are they going to find all this out? And it turns out you've got to do focus groups on that sort of stuff. And there's a certain way of doing it. And it costs them so much to do, and they have a 70% success rate. So every several $100,000 they put into a new chocolate bar, they have a 30% chance of blowing it all away. They might be able to leverage some research, etc. If you could come along to them and say, look, I've got a 80% chance of spotting the one that will succeed, how valuable is your information to their problem? That's just another example. And then, as soon as we think, oh, well, how much should I charge per hour? I think to forget the per hour rate, think of the value of the information to the person needing it. Like if you're going to mean we're going to be more successful 80% of the time instead of 70, that's a 10% gain. We'll split that between us. And that's a big number for someone running a focus group. Of course, you have to have the track record to show you can do it and so on. And people did develop track records to do it. So that's a renovation where information is much more eventful rather than just a sludge that sits in an information system. In the case of discourses, we get a lot of expert discourse, native discourse, personal discourse. I mean, discursomania is upon us. And each of those discourses have a grammar to them, have a logic, have a heart, have a mission, that it would be unwise to just say, well, that's just stuff, because then we're back into umbrage. The interesting question is, how do you deal with that in terms of science? And one of the mistakes that happens here, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon tradition of thinking about science, they think in terms of scientific method, which is prima facie correct. You want to test what you've got. Is it true? Yes, fine. But the interesting question is, where did the data come from? And a lot of science comes from the instrumentation that you're using. So science has got this funny split in it. It's got the theories of explanation and the theories that make instrumentation, that create manifestations. So the second one, instrumentation, is almost like logos made flesh. It's a theory that now has a material embodiment in the form of a microscope, say, and you look inside it and you're seeing objects you cannot normally witness. That's the strong arm of science. So when people now are doing gravitational lensing or all sorts of things, science is a self-disclosing system that other discourses, not all others, but a lot of the others, don't have this weird ability. And there are lots of examples in the history of science where people come up with data from an object and people say, that can't be right. What is that thing? It's a telescope. How does that work? No, we're working with our algebra from the Arabs. No, I'm telling you, there are planets that are going around this way. So there's a really interesting issue here and there's a set of interactions in this domain, but it opens up issues about how instrumentation can be miniaturized and dispersed. So you get, even a mobile phone can have an instrumentation of some sort that captures things so people can do their local science. A good example of this, grab this for an example. Harbour Bridge is painted every 4 years, I think. It never stops. And it's got lead in the paint. It flies up into the air. Oh, the citizens are upset. Well, where is it? Where is it? We'll get experts to do a study. So they put sensors in various places near the thing, this is a good place to put one. So as it turns out, near the bridge, there is a vent because there's a freeway running underneath and it blows up into the air. So if a bird flies over this vent at 300 meters even, you can see it getting blown up out of, think, what just happened to me? So if you throw a lot of little floaty, light-weighted things you get in packing into one of these things, you can actually see them fly up and watch the cloud move and where it goes. And it turns out, under certain circumstances, the winds blow and it hits Kirribilli, runs on the side, and then it hits a certain building for a variety of reasons, then goes down between those two buildings. If you put the sensor there, you've got lead levels that are off the list, off the scale, relative to the standard ones the experts thought they should do. But that's kind of, you need on-site monitoring, you need people keen enough to do it at the time. People think, well, that's going to, because they're outsourcing it to engineering monitoring companies. They think, oh, yeah, well, that'll be costing us, 24/7 observation, people ready to do it. They may not even have the machinery to spot which way things are going and which way the wind's going and knowing whether to spill these things in. I mean, it'll get there, but the interesting thing is people could have these things themselves, not just with traffic as Google does already, but with many, many other things. Similarly with data, like data gets caught up in scientific consortia, and there's no notion about even letting representative samples of it off to have a hackathon, as it were, with 10,000 other scientists in other places because of, patents and there's all sorts of issues. But there's a number of small ways you can extend the reach of having science actually work. Another example in Tassie I did was with forestry. They had they used pesticide after they chopped trees down. They take the quality trees off for craftsmen, but the other stuff they just burn it and it'd be soil. And they put things. So then the question was, where's all this poison going, and to which streams and how much? Again, do we put sensors in, or do we have maybe the school every Friday send the kids along the entire creek to take a sample each? 5 of them perhaps, 5 samples each, 10 minutes apart. Come it all back, measure it and send it off to forestry. I call that COP, Community Observational Project. I forget what to do anyway. The point is, kiddies could play science in a way that actually connected with the public concern about, are we really, really measuring the pollution in the rivers from this thing? Because people are quite histrionical about it, but rightly so or not. And, the scientists say no, but can we trust them? Well, wait a minute, all these kids did it too, and their parents, etc. So, and there's vast horizons on that front as well. And then finally, over in striving here, again, at the level of personal habits, we're into autonomy. We go to weight classes, dance classes, diet, walking, etc., posture, etc., and we want autonomy. Think of the issue of how agile are you with others? So how do you compose or align your strivings with the next guy? Now, ironically, once upon a time, it's faded now, but I did workshops with firemen 20 years ago. Volunteer firefighters had all kinds of really informal mechanisms to be agile. Like one older guy would know how to smell the smoke to work out what kind of leaf was burning around the corner. Others did the clearing because they were young and fit. And there's a sort of an informal chemistry of agility. Now, because of the trucks and the craft, it's much more cocooned. And so everyone's inside that system. Then they're even playing CD music and fighting a fire, looking at the infrared things from above, seeing where things are not being able to spot some of these informal things people actually had as personal knowledge, which was built up over many years by people fighting fires. And ironically now, because those corporates doing it like that, they then have Indigenous firefighting know-how, which has some merits in its own right, but not necessarily in this locale, in this ravine with this vegetation. That's just one example. There's plenty of others of this sort of thing where you're trying to define roles that allow people to think through what sort of verbalization would I have of what I'm doing with these other people. So there's a whole issue about, are we dealing with a performance that could be measured as an outcome, or is it just an activity that you can only see while it's happening? There's a whole series of nominations here about how to describe what's being done. And so when you debrief, and a good contrast today, if you look at some software things, the way agility happens there with these Kanban boards and various other mechanisms to have it so that the flow, the velocity with which stuff is going is very fast, and the ability to narrate what has been done is clean. So when something goes wrong, the back propagation to get it right again is actually quite quick compared to bureaucratic structures that are quite slow. At the level of that bureaucratic structure, the issue there is more, and this is getting particularly crazy in Australia, is to divide or chop up what's otherwise a hierarchy, but think of it as boards, coordinators, facilitators, and clients. And there's a lot of ways you can role play these things such that a board stays focused on the mandate and the mission that they live for. But boards these days can get caught up with the design of a form or gossip or a report about what the government's thinking about things, and leaving it to PR to do a pitch about the mandate. But so I've done a bit of work, actually a fair bit, of socialising the time horizon. The board is long term. coordinators are a shorter cycle, facilitators are in a much shorter cycle, and the client's just got a transaction which may be repeated. And again, there's different mechanisms to make that happen. And finally, with societal settings, and here we have another set of problems. Institutionalization is unraveling because people now think you have to understand what you're getting into or be understood in what you're getting into rather than just doing it as a role for the institution. So for example, you can be sitting at a train station and on the platform it says, "Good morning, customers." When we're not customers, we're commuters. That's the role. And a commuter wants to know what platform, when, and is it crowded. And the facilitators of that need to be thinking, well, what can we do about that? Now, mostly, and this is getting more and more top-heavy, which is our institutions get commandeered by political interests, by catastrophes, by a series of corrosions of monetization underneath, outsourcing arrangements, and so on. So it's not a perfect world, but it's an utterly imperfect world. But there are ways of thinking about institutionalization such that you separate some of these things. Now, all of that is a rough tour of that thing. The bigger problem I've got, and this is where you're going to groan, but the bigger problem, that's just wondering and wondrous. To get those dynamics going that I was sort of alluding to, you need to think about how to animate them. And this is where love comes in. This is what I want to end on here. Anderson and Samuel Alexander does this too. They both play on, Alexander calls it natural piety. Anderson's quite explicit about calling it love, but they both do it in the context of how time-space is the matrix within which the objectivity of the world is given to us. They do it slightly differently, but the upshot of it is that you can map that into the way love gets talked about. So just briefly here, C.S. Lewis wrote a lovely little booklet. It was a BBC broadcast in the 50s called The Four Loves. And he made this thing about there are four loves in the European heritage. I think he was actually meaning it anthropologically: eros, agape, philia, and storge. And he said we need to separate those and understand how they affect each other. So he made the big thing that in Christianity especially, there's a lot of talk about eros, love of God, and love of wanting to be close to God and ascending to a better place, etc., versus agape, which is in the Protestant tradition is sort of seen as it's a gratuity from God. It's like comes from afar to down. And you can't seek favor. It's not that sort of thing. But also C.S. Lewis talks about philia or friendship. And he talks about that as a common group with common interests. But with philia, he talks more there about mothering, about training a person to be a little bit more, competent and so on. And he half makes the point that these things can become pathological. So eros can get eroticized to the point that it's sadomasochistic. Philia can become inward group, special membership. We understand the world. We're the mighty ones. Storge can become mothering, as you're controlling every little step. And agape can become whimsical. Now, a way to think about this in the diagram you can see there is to see eros, agape inside that diagram. Now, the way to think about it is think about us sitting around a table. Eros is encapsulated by face-to-face intimacy. You're talking, doesn't have to be your lover, but I mean, you're talking to someone intimately about stuff you don't have to have any reserve for. That's eros, and there's a constant interest in finding out more of this other who remains a perpetual mystery because there's so much more to find. Storge is much more on the corner. That's a pedagogical relationship where the mother feeds the child at a 90-degree angle of the table, or an instructor looks at an exercise sheet of the student and gives hints and suggests things about how to do that better the next time. And philia is standing on one side, like those pubs you have where the guys are all sitting on one side, or girls as well, or sometimes less combined, because you'll see from the geometry of it, the design of it, is they're sitting on one side watching the passing parade outside the door, outside the pub, and you're passing musing comments about what's going on in the world and so on, and where it's a collective witnessing of the outside. And that's where I can get inward as well. And agape is when it's everyone's around the whole table in an Italian piazza kind of celebration logic, where there's an uplift, which supposedly gets reenacted in communion in churches. But the thing is, it's a lively event, not necessarily with an object either, by the way. So if you look at what I've got there, this square with all its interactions sits inside under a set of morphings of the other 9 domains you looked at. That's why this gets complicated, and why I'm getting it off my head so I can tame the monster, is the eros. If you think of an event here means not just an occurrence, an event like I went to what was it called? How to Capture a PM? Did anyone see that film? Capture a PM? About Malcolm Fraser coming to Monash University. There's a film done of it, and it only just got released. I walked into it innocently to see what it was. That was quite impressive. It took me back to the 70s and the dismissal and all that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing is, being sort of sociologically curious, I was down the bottom of the cinema, so I turned around to look at everyone as the film ended, and it was really interesting. There were easily 50 people, easily 50 that I could catch, but you can't keep staring. It looks a bit strange. I was pretending to look for someone, but the thing is, the emotion fades up. But for a while there, I could feel 50 people unleashing this air of intense regret or anger or joy. It was a series of very different, like held there for a second, because it must have been an intense time at the time. Now that's an event. An event is something that will fire up when you trigger it and will rework memories in the past. And sometimes if someone says something in that moment, and it can open up a whole new future. In Australia, we're really good at burying events, whether it's World War One, II, the dismissal, the voice, not the which way we go, but how we bury the event so that it's not ever a triggerable thing in the future. Flesh is where it gets re-embodied in some collective activity of some sort. And but the interesting thing about event there is it'll fire off into space, and that's a certain erotic form. It also can anchor itself in a place, which is another version, and then those can continue on out to flesh. So eros is the outer square. The arrows are all forms of sublime, or not sublime, displaced friendship transactions. So that example I gave you with courage, between courage and curiosity inside the intuitional function, that's those two characters are in a friendship. So it's not friends as we knew them, just meant as a way of together witnessing something that's happening for that person. So there's 6 of those over and over again. And from that structure, there's all kinds of ways you can intervene at the interactional level, with new content and so on. The square on the inside marks out a certain kind of praxis. And so each of those things have got praxis issues, so you can actually intervene at certain points, delicately usually, and make a change. Now, all of that can be quite overwhelming and confusing, and apologies for that, but trust me, I am my own worst critic, so I will rework this. And those of you who want a copy of this paper, which will come out, I'm more than happy to send you, and feel free to comment. And just finally, from question of how does this function as a movement? One example that I'm using at the moment is what I call residential resilience, which is the whole issue of how do you alter an apartment block such that it has a kind of communal vibe to it. Not by everyone getting homogeneously behind a communal outlook where we like each other because we're all the same. No, this is something where you've got people completely different, wouldn't necessarily get on, but still for want of being able to get certain things done quickly, cleanly, and cheaply than the current way you do it, by calling up contractors, the strata managers, and all sorts of people. And that one is, a lot of work because you've got to go through a lot of, it might be a door jam, it could be a suicide attempt, it could be rewiring, it could be lots and lots of things. But over a period of time, there's a certain edge that happens to this that people start to think there's something here that's different. And this is an exemplification of what it means to love the neighbour, because it's not a condescension of, oh, that poor guy needs my help. It's more the dare of thinking, why on earth do we do this every bloody time? And just as a footnote to this, the thing that sparked me onto this was 8 years ago, I came across Clive James' translation of the Divine Comedy, which blew my mind away because I hadn't appreciated what Dante was doing. Very, very, very clever guy. But one upshot of it is he captures the nature of hell, albeit in the medieval notion of the afterlife. But when you bring it into the now, he trains your ear to hear people complain about their plight in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of, with great, sometimes great passion even. But they're in a cycle that's not going to transform anyway because they're all doing it to each other. And so that thing I mentioned about waste, umbrage, and violence is like a hellish grip that's squeezing people. And I'm sitting there trying to unloosen it in locales where I can do something that then can generically propagate. So this is like what software can do for you. Once you do it once, embody it and show it, you can then propagate it to something else. And people then, oh, yeah, that's kind of cool. And off you go. So there, I'll end there. And any questions, reactions, welcome.
Well, thank you, Richard. Would you like to stop share?
Stop share.
Well, thank you, Richard Volpato, for addressing the Existentialist Society on social renovation as a social change strategy.